Hello, and you are welcome to this week's episode of Indo Politics. I'm Tabitha Monahan, and this week I am joined by my colleague on the political team, Cónal Thomas, who was with me for his first episode of Indo Politics. So, Cónal, I'm going to kick off this week, and I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this because I think really everybody has been... It's probably ad nauseum now has been discussed, but it's the Fianna Fáil meltdown that we all witnessed since Sunday. Particularly, I want to start with the parliamentary party meeting that happened on Wednesday night. The two of us were in Leinster House. You were a little bit later than I was, burning the midnight oil, trying to figure out what was going on. It was a little bit quieter in relation to leaks than you would have anticipated.
It certainly was. I mean, we're kind of gearing up, I suppose, for this fireworks really all day after the Jim Gavin campaign withdrawal and the meltdown and the questions over the leadership, etc., etc. How would this go? What would the rebels say? Who would back the Taoiseach? What explanations would be given, etc. And it would have been, just after 7, I would have seen the Fianna Fáil members of the parliamentary party traipsing upstairs to the 5th floor, and off they went, and would have kicked off around then. And then really it was probably an hour, maybe an hour and a half, I'd say before we heard anything, how things were going. That was deliberate, I don't know, but maybe it was, Look, the long and the short of it was that, we understand that Taoiseach and Fianna Fáil leader Micheál Martin got up and gave quite a conciliatory sort of speech. There seemed to be some disagreement of how explicit an apology he gave, but he certainly took onus for it, said he was devastated over how things were handled. And then as the meeting went on, bits and bobs are coming out, and now the party has agreed to what they're calling a review of this, that a committee will be set up, led by Brendan Smith, the chair of the parliamentary party, and Paul McAuliffe. The terms of that have not been set, and I think there's a bit of concern over that, and I think this is something that's going to be really closely watched over the next week. The party will meet next Wednesday, and those terms will be set out. Seems to be some suggestions today amongst people who may not be in Micheál's camp that he will ultimately set the terms of what they're looking at and who's on it. But in many ways, we're really still none the wiser over what happened, who knew when, and all the rest of it. Yeah,
we did know that there was a lot of emotion prior to this meeting, and I think probably a lot of that really stemmed from shock. I think on Monday that this had happened, that Jim Gavin had withdrawn from the party. He was going to remain on the ballot, but ultimately the Fianna Fáil were no longer in the election anymore. So I think there was a lot of shock, there was a lot of emotion there. But did that kind of petered off then towards the PP? Like, I think some of us were promised that there was going to be fireworks, there was going to be blood on the walls. That didn't really happen. Do you think Micheál Martin being kind of contrite and issuing some kind of apology, whatever way that played out, do you think that took the sting out of it?
I think it did, but I think if you look at the timeline of this, there was sort of suggestions on Sunday after the Week in Politics debate that Jim Gavin could stand down. We got the email in about 10:31 at night, gone. Everything blows up. Monday, it's this huge dramatic fiasco. Huge questions being asked, and what happens on Tuesday is the most boring budget of all time, but one which we as journalists and the media all have to cover extensively. And so I think by the time you got to Wednesday evening, bear in mind the meeting wasn't until 7 p.m, people, a lot of journalists, politicians, ministers after budget day tend to be exhausted.
It's a long day.
Some worse for wear for other reasons. So as I say, by the time the party met, I think the sting had gone out of the tail a little bit, and I think then... And bear in mind, Micheál Martin was calling people all day on Wednesday. Conciliatory, trying to get them on board, calm this, because had it been anything else, there could have been moves towards what might have been a heave. You also earlier in the day had Jim O'Callaghan, right, who was asked about his leadership ambitions.
This was interesting, I thought.
After this whole fiasco, Jack Chambers, the deputy leader, is now being considered damaged goods, effectively, in the party to take over from Micheál Martin. Whenever that happens, we might get onto that in a minute. Jim O'Callaghan said, do I have leadership ambitions? Yeah, of course. I mean, absolutely, but not right now. It's not an urgent priority for me. And that was just an interesting little bit. He didn't quite go as far enough to say, we need to move on now. So by the time the parliamentary party meeting met, as I say, and Micheál Martin got up and was conciliatory and said he was devastated, and there was sort of some contrary reports about whether his voice was quivering, his hand was shaking, but
emotional.
When that comes out, people kind of go, okay, he's kind of got this in the bag. He's gonna be okay.
Yeah. Let's come to that leadership question, though, because actually it was Sean O'Farrell who was the former Ceann Comhairle, so many people will know him. He was the one who kind of didn't outright say, you know, there should be a question over leadership in the future. I think he put it at January 2027, which is in line with the Ireland being having the EU presidency. What did you make of that? Do you think that was the inevitable, that was where it was going to go regardless? Like, a lot of people had said, Micheál Martin, when he has to step down as Taoiseach in November 2027, maybe he mightn't continue as Fianna Fáil leader.
Before the Jim Gavin fiasco, the common wisdom, I suppose, would have told you that Micheál Martin, who has, bear in mind, publicly said he's going to lead Fianna Fáil to the next election, he has to say that, let's be real, would either stand down at the handover in late 2027 or he would go the full 5 years. Sean O'Farrell, shrewd enough move, I think, by him, kind of has laid the groundwork now for a conversation within the party, and I think it's one that a number of members will welcome. EU presidency next year, get to January 2027 and begin the planning. Remember, the words he used were the process of renewal, right?
Yeah.
That would allow for, effectively, a leadership contest in the summer and a new leader to be in place as tarnished, bear in mind, the handover to Simon Harris and Fine Gael as Taoiseach. Now, like, speaking to a few people today, they would say it's ultimately still going to be Micheál Martin's call. He's damaged by this, absolutely. I mean, he was a leader who was in total control of his party up until a few weeks ago. With
some people who weren't happy with him. But that was, it was always going to be the case, yeah.
That's always been the case. And I think what this has done is it has expedited it. And really, my instinct was we will look back on yesterday and the last few days as the start, the beginning of the end for Micheál Martin.
Yeah, and was it too premature for people to think that Micheál Martin could be gone by Christmas, or Micheál Martin was kind of the end was nigh for him as leader? Because, I mean, realistically speaking, how Jim O'Callaghan did say, I have leadership ambitions, it wasn't like Jim O'Callaghan had the time to start getting the numbers together.
No, and bear in mind, anyone who'd want to challenge Micheál Martin for leadership, and it would most likely be a senior minister like Jim O'Callaghan or Jack Chambers. Darragh O'Brien was being talked about a bit today. They are going to want to, particularly I think if you look at Jim O'Callaghan and Jack Chambers, they're going to want to bed into their ministries. They're going to be a little bit more under their belts, I think, before they would want to take that step up. I think that's what you'll probably see play out. And bear in mind, Jim O'Callaghan's only been a senior minister, having refused a junior ministry a few years ago for the 8 months the coalition's up and running. Jack Chambers was, brought in as finance minister towards the business end of the last government and is now in deeper. And, I think he's had a very rocky few weeks as deputy leader, because on the one hand, there's the Jim Gavin fiasco, which,
As Director of Elections.
And he was kind of central to that campaign, if you can call it that.
Yep.
And on the one hand then, frustrating all his cabinet colleagues during the budget negotiations. And this is why I say, I think at this juncture, Jack Chambers is being seen as his star has fallen dramatically in the party in the last few days.
Does he have time to fix that, though?
I think he does, but I do wonder the problem with being... well, there's two things. One, Minister for Public Expenditure tends not to be a very, sexy department.
Yeah, or well liked when you come to budget negotiations, because that's when you really have to draw a line and be really strict with people.
Could be, or you could be really disliked because you're not giving people the money. And then also, we're not going to have another election after the presidential for some time. So, I don't know. We'll see.
Let's talk a little bit more about the presidential election. 2 now on the ballot. Well, there'd be 3, but 2 who are actually contesting this election. Heather Humphreys and Catherine Connolly. What kind of week have they had? What's the dynamic of the election now, just having 2 people?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a way, since Jim Gavin's exit, they're both still, out campaigning and doing what they're doing, and that's fine. But it has shifted the dynamic a little bit, because I think both candidates and both camps realise, okay, we've 2 weeks left in this, or just over 2 weeks. We need to refocus a little bit on our attack points, how we present ourselves. But in saying that, there hasn't been a huge amount of shifted the ground, is my read of it, in terms of the talking points of the campaign. We can talk about that in a minute. They've both been out in Dublin today. We've seen questions the last few days around Catherine Connolly and some of, comments she made yesterday on the radio. And, I mean, Heather Humphreys, you were out with her earlier, I think, yourself. You can talk a little bit more about that than I could. I get the sense her campaign is still not quite got the energy behind it.
That's exactly what I thought today. Now, in fairness, this is my first time that I was out with Catherine Connolly, out with Heather Humphreys on a canvas. That's exactly how I felt. I didn't know how comfortable Heather looked talking to people. Now, speaking to other journalists who have been out in the campaign trail, she said, she has been good. She's been talking to people. Some people have been really thrilled to speak with her, but it was just, we were at the Mespel Road lunch market, so I think maybe some people were sitting on a bench and they were trying to have their lunch, and they're trying to have their falafel wraps or whatever it was, and then Heather Humphreys was landing in, plus all of her team, plus all of the nation's media on top of her, and everybody, and the cameras and everything. Like, if you're eating a chicken fillet roll, not ideal that you have all these cameras and Heather Humphreys trying to shake your hand.
Might not want to talk to a politician
not
right
ideal.
at that moment.
Right at that moment, I don't think ideal. So I think maybe it could have been the setting. What I thought about Heather Humphreys today, though, was that she really took the opportunity to poke holes at Catherine Connolly in relation to this comment, as you referenced there, when Catherine Connolly was asked about whether or not she would hire a convicted rapist in the Áras. And this kind of goes back to the story about her trying to hire a woman who had gun convictions for a role in her Dáil office. Heather Humphreys was saying this should have been an outright no straight away, and she needs to clarify what she meant, because I think what Catherine said at the time was, I'd need to reflect on that. You know, as a woman, I react one way, but we know that she's very passionate about rehabilitation. So she didn't outright say yes or no, but she did then come out the next day and say, no, absolutely not. If they're on the sex offenders list, I would not hire them. What did you make of that whole thing?
Well, I think initially the question that was put to Catherine Connolly yesterday by Kieran Cuddihy, you can argue she prevaricated, but I think the way she came at the answer was the wrong, was more the kind of the nuance there.
Okay.
You know, she was kind of saying, I'd have to reflect on that. I think a lot of people took that up to mean, oh, she's not ruling it out. And while that's true, she was coming at it from the rehabilitation point of view, and she reiterated that point just there on the drive time debate. But anyway, what we saw today was the Fine Gael attack dogs really out in force. Health Minister, excuse me, Jennifer Carroll McNeill out saying, absolutely not, completely criticising Catherine Connolly, and Heather Humphreys then on the campaign trail saying the same. I mean, how much of that washes, I don't really know with the electorate.
I agree, and actually I want to come to whether or not you think the issue around Catherine Connolly being a barrister for banks in terms of home repossessions as well. I think the argument from people is that there's maybe hypocrisy.
Sure.
And I think that's really what the crux of the issue is. It's not necessarily whether or not she did or did not represent banks in relation to those cases. It's that she was very passionate about keeping people in their homes and would advocate for people like that. And we know that what Catherine's position is on that. Again, though, do you think that that'll cut through to the voters?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in a way, I think that could work in Catherine Connolly's favour. I'll explain why. I mean, so yes, the argument is that while she was a sitting councillor, she was advocating for people, trying to get homes, while then acting as a barrister in repossession cases. Now, she has said, and she's pointed out several times today already, I think, that, a barrister doesn't choose, they have to do the work they're given. What was interesting was the Bar Council effectively coming out and saying this is true. You have to say, when an official body comes out like that, and that's supposed to be apolitical, but on a point of clarity of the law, I think most people will kind of look at that and go, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Let's talk about the debate. We had a drive time debate today, so this is the first one where it's just the two of them. What did you make of it? Winners, losers? Who do you think came out on top?
I mean, I would have probably put Catherine slightly ahead of Heather, but I've probably often said that in the last few debates. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of change. I think we were talking just about before we came on air, which was interesting, is I feel like we have maybe heard this debate numerous times.
We certainly have.
Yeah, sure.
For sure. It's the same, and this is exactly what we were talking about, whether or not we've heard the same talking points. It's defence, it's housing and that. And it always comes back to policy, government policy, which is not something the President can deal with. It's not their brief. Why do you think that is? Because you have an interesting theory now.
Yeah, I thought for a few weeks since the campaign kind of began properly, when you think about all these points you think about defence and you think about militarisation, whatever, all the comments that have been made on that, as well as housing, homelessness, etc. These are Michael D. Higgins' talking points, right? And Michael D has been in the Áras now for 14 years. He's widely respected, I would say, as a, not by everyone, I should say, but as a president. I think he'll probably be missed. And I think it's interesting how outspoken he has been on those issues is framing this presidential campaign in many ways. And that's what we just heard on Drive Time, was those points. He was even referenced a number of times. He has said this, he has said that. You know, there was a question of, you know, would you say the US and Israel should be removed off the UN, you know, out of the UN, etc. And, you know, Catherine Connolly saying I'd have to reflect on that, Heather Humphreys saying no, because you should include everyone. Anyway, the point is that these are the flashpoints of this campaign have been ones that he has been so outspoken on for so many years now. In a way, I think the political debate has to be framed by him, because he has set the bar for the presidency.
He set the tone,
He set the tone, but he's also, in many ways, he's set the tone for politicising the office. Let's be frank about it.
I don't think people are necessarily angry about that, though. I think the public are supportive of it, especially because he's been so outspoken on Gaza, the conflict over there. I think people have really welcomed that from him, because they see him as a neutral person within that sphere, and they're saying, yes, that is what we want on the world stage. That's how we want Ireland to be represented.
And what you've seen a little bit sometimes when both Catherine Connolly and Heather Humphreys are uncomfortable with those questions is they're coming back to the role of presidents. It's an easy fallback for them. Particularly, I think Heather Humphreys does that probably more often.
The problem there, though, is that we don't learn a lot about them.
No, we don't.
Which is the problem. And I wonder, will that come back to bite them? That if they're not able to give some kind of answer on that.
Yeah, like I've often thought in the last few weeks, I mean, I think Catherine Connolly is far more obviously of, you know, Michael D. Higgins kind of side of the house, of maybe not, you know, Labour, we know the history there and all the rest of it, but certainly she is of that persuasion. Heather Humphreys is not. And what I find it's strange about, in a way, about, she's gotten better, but Heather's campaign, there's two things. I mean, one, I don't know if she's brushed up as much on those issues as maybe she could.
Yeah, and especially compared to Catherine.
Yes, well, but I think that's also reflective of the fact that she wasn't a TD of that persuasion sitting in the Dáil in the opposition benches. She was a government minister. And then, perhaps unlucky for Heather Humphreys, more often than not, the media have simply gone after her record in government. Yeah. You know, and gone back to the austerity years, which, you know, you can argue, is that fair? She wasn't a minister for all of those years.
She does sometimes bring it up herself, though. So, you know, when she was asked about austerity, she does go back to her track record. She said, you know, I brought in the pandemic unemployment payment and I made sure that it was boosted, and that during Brexit I made sure that businesses were protected. So she seems to try to straddle that line, you know, being a government minister. But it's a difficult one, though.
It is, but in many ways I don't think from her experience she has necessarily a huge amount to fall back on. Yeah. You know? I mean, one of the things she often keeps saying is, I think one of her main attack points against Catherine Connolly is, you know, who do you want representing you on the world stage? Someone who will bring in business for Ireland. And I think most voters be kind of go, what are you talking about? Yeah. The president doesn't bring in enterprise or bring in business.
I thought an interesting line, and I wonder how successful it'll be in cutting through, is, you know, Catherine Connolly is insulting our allies, and do you want that on the world stage? You know, and maybe that might cut through a little bit more in terms of Catherine's track record. She's more willing to criticise the likes of Germany, the likes of France, the US. She is more than Heather is, and maybe there's some cautious people who might see
the military-industrial complex again.
No, I don't think we'll do that today. Maybe not. But something that did jump out at me during that debate was actually a really simple one. It was the Occupied Territories Bill. Yeah. I feel like this is just a simple answer for both of them. Catherine Connolly, in fairness, she was the one who put the question to Heather. Do you support the goods and services being in the Occupied Territories Bill? We know what Catherine thinks. She thinks both need to be in. We know what the Fine Gael leader thinks, Simon Harris. He thinks generally services should be included, but that he's gone to seek legal advice from the Attorney General.
It seems,
Heather fudged that.
It seems strange that wasn't just what could have been just a very simple answer. I mean,
very simple answer.
So we know, as you say, like Simon Harris has certainly said he's open to having services in there. You know, he sought advice, as you said, from the Attorney General, and instead Heather Humphreys' response seemed to be, I'm not involved in that. Yeah. I've been out of politics for the last year and a half.
I don't know what's in the bill.
I'll leave it up to the Oireachtas. It has to make its way through, etc., etc. Quite weak, I would say, on that point. And then it almost seemed to double down on her earlier comments about how it wouldn't necessarily make a difference, or at least she framed the question that when she was asked a few weeks ago, and she kind of let slip, like, Asher, what would it make a difference given all the bombardment? And then, in fairness, she defended that today, saying yes, but it was made in the context of just, this is so much bigger than just one bill, which, let's face it, it is.
No, it's true. But I think you need to be very clear on what you support, what you don't, and don't try and use the presidency as an out. People want to know what you believe on this particular matter.
I mean, if she has concerns about the inclusion of services in the way it might impact Ireland's FDI, and impact companies like Airbnb or whatever it is, say that.
Yeah. Be very clear as to why. But I think one way or the other, I think the important point here is that you need to be clear instead of using that kind of off-ramp of saying, sorry, this is the government, this is government policy, this is their beef now, and this has nothing got to do with me. Let's talk about the budget. I don't want to spend too long on the budget because, my God, like you said earlier on, it was a boring budget. So what I'm going to ask you is 2 questions. Anything jump out from you from the budget? And 2, do you think it will impact the presidential election?
I think the main takeaway from the budget was just how much it sets the trajectory for the next 5 years and what we could be in for.
What do you mean by that?
We've seen that now that Fine Gael hold the finance briefing will for the next few years, we've seen those income tax cuts, those USC cuts gone now. They kind of alluded this week saying, look, they might come back next year, we'll try and make progressivity. I'm not convinced. This was we spun to you that it's a very pro-enterprise budget. And fair enough, the VAT cut, but I think the VAT cut for the hospitality sector is completely blown up in their face. Yeah,
and I think it will further down the line if we continue to see the hospitality sector struggle. If we continue to see restaurants and cafes close, and we have the Restaurants Association coming out saying, we're struggling here big time. And it's the same for the VAT cut for developers as well. If we don't see apartments being built, if we don't see those not even the completions, just the start of these apartment blocks being built, that's going to be a serious banana skin for the government.
Yeah, 6 months' time, 12 months' time, as you say. And I think not just, apartments don't dramatically ramp up, but then on the VAT cut, if prices aren't passed, if they're not lowered and people still feel like they're getting
5 or 6 quid for a cappuccino,
stiffed in their cafe, stiffed in the restaurant, they're going to have to stand over this. Now, we could argue, it's not actually an argument, every government makes unpopular decisions in their first few months. This was just a particularly, I think, unpopular budget. Yeah. But look, I don't think it'll... Now, so to your second question, will it impact the presidential race? I think it could further compound in people's minds where that idea that Heather Humphreys, that a lot of people have thrown at her, is this 14 years of Fine Gael. And this seems to be a continuation of that. In fact, if you look at it, it's like, I do find it remarkable talking about this budget as being sort of austere or stingy when it's actually record spending. It's
billions.
It's the biggest budget basically in forever, basically. Yeah. And but as I say, I do think that could feed into people's thinking. Notably, and it was interesting, Catherine Connolly's been, she's been in the Dáil every day this week. You've probably seen her yourself. She was in there earlier today, in between campaigning. She was up in the Dáil criticising the fact that there was no disability payment that was promised.
The weekly one, yeah.
Yeah. So she's obviously using this as an opportunity quite cleverly. I just think it'll compound in people's minds, those who may not be certain which way to go, but I don't know how much will shift a lot of people's minds. Yeah.
Right, let's kick into the next week anyway. Where do we see things going? I think it's going to just limp along the way that it has, unless something else explosive happens. I feel like Catherine Connolly and Heather Humphreys have kind of set in motion what their campaign is going to be like, and I don't know if that's necessarily going to change. I think we're going to see much of the same.
Yeah, I'm sure each campaign team, you're heading into the business end of it, and I think we're tomorrow 2 weeks out. Yeah. There's going to have to be a bit of a charge up. I think Catherine Connolly's campaign will continue its, frames its kind of grassroots, going around the pubs, going around the bars, having the meetings, getting out campaigning. Heather Humphreys will probably do much the same. She's down, I think, in the South tomorrow. She's down in Waterford and Cork. What I'd be interested to see now, there's a debate on Sunday.
There is, this week, yeah.
And one of the things I'll be looking out for is what kind of questions will be asked, because if it's the same talking points that we've heard for the last 2-3 weeks, I do think people could end up switching off. And then it becomes about the ground game, which is so much harder to read.
Yep. And turnout. I think turnout's going to be a massive issue for this election.
Yeah.
I know it was record low at the last one. I think that was mainly because a lot of people just assumed Michael D. Higgins was going to come back again. I just wonder, are people inspired to come out to vote this time?
I think people who back Catherine Connolly might be motivated and mobilised to come out in that way. You know, we obviously had the poll last week which showed Jim Gavin's transfers where they were going, and Catherine Connolly's still out on top, and there's that sense that Heather's in danger now that Jim Gavin's dropped out. But I do wonder to a certain extent if the Gavin fiasco, and now that it's a two-horse race, has kind of made people a bit jaded and just gone, no, do you know what? Whatever.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it on that.
Sorry about that.
No. Cónal, thanks a million. I'm Tabitha Monahan. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Indo Politics. You can follow all the latest updates on the presidential election and any fallout maybe that there might be in the budget over the weekend on the Irish Independent website. And don't forget to subscribe to the Irish Independent's YouTube channel.